6. Translator, and less fantasy. Translator, and less fantasy translation editor, and less fantasy translation. Forget what? Sierra, what are you talking about? Eve asked, pretending not to know. It seems like no one has paid for this meal yet, Sierra said with a smile. After hearing her words, everyone was stunned. Eve had already mentioned earlier that he was treating them to this meal, so no one remembered the idea of paying the bill. But now Sierra unexpectedly mentioned it, and everyone couldn't understand what she was up to. Sierra, I'm treating you all to this meal, you don't need to pay. He quickly smiled and replied. At this point, he naturally understood the meaning behind her words, and his response was just playing along with her act. Eve, with so many of us here today, how can we let you treat us? If you can give us a discount, we'll be very happy. After all, you only know me, and you're not familiar with the others, so it's not your turn to pay, she replied lightly, then turned her head to look at Connor and whispered, and also, you probably don't know, but we also have a rich heir here that casually throws around millions. So it's definitely not your turn to pay. If you pay today, won't it be embarrassing for him? Although Sierra didn't mention Connor's name explicitly, her words were very straightforward, implying that this meal should be paid for by Connor. Mina wasn't a fool either. She naturally understood the meaning behind Sierra's words and subconsciously turned her head to glance at Connor. I think Sierra is right. This meal should indeed be paid by Connor. After all, we all came here because of him. If you don't want to treat us at the Fairy Lake Resort, then treating us to a meal here is also fine. Sasha quickly joined in after realizing the situation, speaking in a challenging tone. That's right, Connor, there shouldn't be a problem with you treating us for this meal. After all, you're so wealthy. You can casually donate millions in Mina's live stream. Treating us to a meal shouldn't be difficult, right? Mavis was even more direct, standing up and shouting at Connor. Hearing this, Connor lifted his head lightly and glanced at Mavis, smiling faintly without saying a word. Update on B Omicron X0 VEL.C Omicron M. At this moment, he already knew what these people wanted to do, but he didn't expect that Clara's motive for doing this was to expose his true identity. He thought she just wanted to take advantage of him. Mina, sitting next to Connor, began to look nervous. She knew that Connor definitely couldn't come up with that money. After all, she was very familiar with his situation. I didn't expect him to be a rich heir. It's true that one shouldn't be the one paying for this meal. But one can give you a 20% discount. What do you think? Eve saw that his plan had succeeded and said to Connor with a smile. A 20% discount. Connor smiled faintly when he heard this, then said, You're quite generous. Let's go with a 20% discount then. I'll treat you all to this meal. Sierra, Eve and the others did not expect him to agree. They were stunned on the spot, and their expressions were abnormally shocked. Under normal circumstances, even if this meal was 20% off, all the dishes and the bottle of red wine worth $60,000 would cost nearly $100,000. Connor should not be able to take out this money, but they did not expect him to agree. Why did he agree? Eve narrowed his eyes and looked at Connor. He secretly regretted saying that he would give a 20% discount. He should have asked him to pay the full amount. However, he had already said those words just now, and if he were to take them back now, it would be quite embarrassing. So he could only grit his teeth and say, All right, since Connor is so generous, one won't insist on splitting the bill with you today. Waiter, come and calculate the bill. Okay. After hearing this, the waiter quickly took the invoice and entered the private room. Then, in a soft voice, the waiter said, Mr. Eve, the total cost of this meal is $125,800. After hearing the waiter's words, everyone was dumbfounded. They opened their mouths wide, their expressions filled with astonishment. They never expected the dishes at Eve family restaurant to be so expensive. A table full of food cost $125,000. Even for a rich heir, that was not a small sum of money. After all, they were all students, and at most, they received a monthly living allowance of $5,000. For an ordinary student, it was only $1,000 or $2,000 per month. So spending $125,000 on a single meal was indeed shocking. But they might not know that just the bottle of wine Eve ordered cost $60,000. Sierra and Eve wore smug smiles when they heard the price. They knew very well that Connor couldn't possibly come up with that money. "Do you want to check the bill, everyone?" At that moment, the waiter spoke again. "No need to bother," Connor casually replied when he heard those words. After all, that amount of money meant nothing to him. Even if it were 1 or 2 million, he wouldn't care. So of course, he wouldn't mind $100,000. Mina, on the other hand, became even more puzzled when she heard his words. She couldn't understand why he seemed like a different person, completely indifferent to the money. "So who will pay the bill?" The waiter hesitated for a moment and asked Eve. "Do we still need to ask?" "Of course it's Mr. Connor," he replied with a smile, then looked at the waiter and continued, "These people are all my friends, so give them an 80% discount." "All right, Mr. Eve." The waiter, knowing his identity, quickly responded and walked over to Connor, saying in a respectful voice, "Sir, the total cost of this meal is $125,873. After the discount and rounding off the remaining change, the total will be $100,600. "Oh, forget about the 600, just charge him 100,000. Eve quickly shouted after hearing this. Clearly, he thought that even $100,000 would be impossible for Connor to come up with. All right. The waiter hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, "Mr. Connor, the total comes to $100,000. Will you be paying in cash or by card?" Connor heard the waiter's words and slowly raised his head to look at the waiter. Meanwhile, Sierra, Eve and the others wore smug expressions, as if they were waiting to see Connor embarrass himself. 0.